Close your eyes. Imagine, for a moment, that the world outside has begun to fade. The sharp edges of the day, the noise, the rush, the endless demands on your attention are softening, dissolving into a gentle velvet gray. You are standing at the edge of a great quiet moor. The air here is different. It is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient stone. There is no need to hurry here. There is no one waiting for you to be anything other than exactly who you are in this breath. In the distance, a grand old house sits among the shadows, its chimneys reaching toward a sky filled with the first faint stars. This is Mistlethwaite Manor. It is a place of 1,000 rooms, many of them locked, many of them sleeping. But we aren't going inside just yet. Instead, we are looking for something smaller, something hidden. Do you feel that? A slight shift in the wind. It carries a secret. Long ago, there was a girl named Mary. But she wasn't the kind of girl you see in storybooks, smiling and bright. No, Mary was like a winter branch. Stiff, cold, and seemingly lifeless. She had been raised in a land of heat and harsh sun, surrounded by people who served her but never saw her. She was a child of silence, growing up in the gaps between her mother's parties and her father's work. When the fever came and took everyone away, Mary was left in a house that felt like a tomb. She wasn't sad, because she didn't know how to love. She was simply empty. But emptiness, you see, is a beginning. It is a space waiting to be filled. Now, imagine Mary traveling. Not the fast, jarring travel of our modern world, but the slow, rhythmic swaying of a carriage. The steady clop, clop, clop of horse moves against the damp English road. The sound is hypnotic. It creates a bridge between the life she knew and the mystery she is about to enter. Outside the window, the landscape changes. The vibrant colors of India are replaced by the deep greens and moody purples of the Yorkshire moors. It is a vast, rolling ocean of land, stretching out into the dark. She is moving toward a place where secrets are buried deep in the soil. A place where a garden has been sleeping for 10 long years, waiting for the right touch to wake it up. You can almost hear the garden breathing, a slow, subterranean pulse beneath the frost. It isn't dead. It is just resting, much like your mind is beginning to rest now. The house is coming into view, a dark, low silhouette against the clouds. Mary doesn't know it yet, but within these walls, and beyond the ivy-covered stone, her heart is about to break open. Not from pain, but like a seed cracking to let the green life out. As the carriage slows to a final, gentle halt, the silence of the moor settles over everything. It is a heavy, comforting silence. It wraps around the manor like a blanket. You are safe here. You are a guest in this story, drifting along the same path she took. The heavy iron knocker hits the door, a dull, grounded thud that echoes through the halls. The journey has ended, and the transformation is about to begin. But before we see what lies behind those heavy oak doors, we must understand the weight of the air Mary breathed in those first few moments of arrival. A stillness that held the promise of a hidden world. The heat in India was a heavy thing. It was not the kind of warmth that invites you to play. It was a thick, oppressive weight that made the air feel as though it were made of liquid gold, slow and hard to breathe. In that house, the young Mary Lennox lived like a ghost. She would sit on the cool, tiled floor of her nursery, playing with wooden soldiers in a silence so deep it felt as though the world had ended miles beyond the veranda. Imagine the absolute stillness of a colonial bungalow at noon. The only movement is the slow, hypnotic swaying of a heavy silk curtain in a faint, hot breeze. There was no laughter in those rooms. Her mother, a woman of porcelain beauty and shimmering dresses, moved through the house like a butterfly that refused to land. She was a vision of lace and pale yellow, always heading to a dinner, a dance, or a garden party, where the laughter was bright but thin. Mary watched her from the shadows of the doorways. A thin, sour-faced child who knew the touch of her Aya's hands but never the warmth of a mother's embrace. In this place, Mary learned the art of being still. She learned to exist without belonging. The servants bowed. They obeyed. They hurried to bring her lime juice or to fasten her shoes. But their eyes were always looking past her, toward the next task, the next command. She was a child grown in a garden of neglect, her roots shallow, her spirit brittle like sun-dried grass. And then the silence changed. One morning the usual sounds of the household, the clinking of tea sets, the murmuring of servants were gone. In their place was a terrifying, hollow quiet. The heat seemed to intensify, shimmering over the gardens where the roses hung their heads, thirsty and forgotten. A sickness had crept into the town, a dark cloud that did not care for wealth or status. It swept through the bungalow with invisible feet, leaving behind a void that no one dared to fill. Mary hid in her nursery. She stayed there for hours, then days, forgotten in the panic. She watched a small green lizard dart across the floor, its tiny heart beating visibly against its skin. She felt a strange, detached calm. The world she knew was dissolving, melting away like wax under a flame. When the soldiers finally found her, standing alone in the center of a silent room, they looked at her with pity and fear. She was the only thing left alive in a house that had become a monument to what once was. Now, let your mind drift with her. Leave the scorched earth of India behind. Feel the transition. The air begins to cool. The stifling yellow light fades into a deep, misty blue. Mary is on a ship now, a great iron vessel cutting through the dark waters of the ocean. Can you hear it? The deep, subterranean vibration of the hull, a sound so low it is felt in the bones rather than heard. It is a heartbeat for the heartless. The ship sways a slow, mountainous roll from side to side. Left, dot, and right, left, and right. The salt spray hits the deck with a soft, persistent hiss, like the sound of 1,000 needles hitting silk. She spent long hours staring at the horizon, where the gray sky met the gray sea. For the first time in her life, Mary was truly between worlds. She belonged to nothing and no one. The officials who took charge of her spoke in hushed tones about the poor, plain child and the lonely manor in Yorkshire that awaited her. Mary did not care. She wrapped her coat tighter around her thin shoulders and let the rhythm of the waves lull her into a state of suspended animation. She was shedding her old skin. The sourness, the anger, the entitlement, they were being washed away by the cold Atlantic wind. She was becoming a blank page, waiting for a new story to be written in a different ink. As the ship docked in the rain-slicked harbor of England, the air was sharp and smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. It was a shock to her lungs, a cold wake-up call from a long, feverish dream. She was met by a woman named Mrs. Medlock, a person of stout proportions and keys that jingled with a heavy curry, metallic finality at her waist. Mrs. Medlock did not offer a hug. She offered a sturdy umbrella and a seat in a dark carriage. The journey north began. The train tracks sang a metallic song of distance, a steady, rhythmic percussion against the iron rails as the flat lands of the south gave way to the rugged, rising bones of the north. Mary leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window. The world outside was turning dark. The trees became silhouettes, reaching up like twisted fingers against a charcoal sky. They were moving away from the sun, away from the noise of life, and toward the great silence of the moors. Mrs. Medlock began to speak of Mr. Archibald Craven, the man who lived in the house of 100 rooms. She spoke of his hunched back, his broken heart, and his dislike of the world. But Mary hardly listened. She was watching the darkness thicken. The carriage was waiting at the station. As they climbed inside, the leather seats smelled of old dust and rain. The horses leaned into their harnesses, and the final leg of the journey commenced. They were leaving the paved roads, heading into a place where the wind had its own voice. A low, mournful howl that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. "That's the moor," Mrs. Medlock whispered, almost to herself. "Miles and miles of wild land that nothing lives on but the gorse and the broom and the sheep." Mary looked out into the void. It looked like a black sea, endless and mysterious. She felt small, smaller than she had ever felt in India. But in that smallness, there was a strange new safety. No one expected anything of her here. She was just a speck in the vast, sleeping landscape. The carriage wheels crunched on gravel. A wall appeared out of the fog, a high, stone wall that seemed to stretch forever. Behind it lay the secrets of Mistlethwaite. As the heavy iron gates swung open with a slow, grinding sigh, Mary felt a shiver that was not from the cold. She had arrived at the edge of the mystery. The echoes of India were finally silent, replaced by the dripping of rain from ancient eaves and the heavy, expectant breath of a house that had been waiting for a child to wake its halls. The iron gates of Mistlethwaite Manor closed behind the carriage, with a sound that was both final and strangely comforting. It was a heavy, metallic thud that seemed to say, "The rest of the world is out there, but here you are enclosed." As the wheels rolled over the thick gravel of the long, winding drive, the manor began to emerge from the Yorkshire mist. It was a sprawling, low-slung fortress of dark stone, its many windows glinting like watchful eyes under the heavy brow of the roof. To Mary, looking out from the shadows of the carriage, the house did not look like a home. It looked like a castle from a forgotten century, a place where time had decided to stop and rest. The ivy clung to the walls in thick, twisted ropes, shivering slightly in the cold night wind. But as the great oak door swung open, the biting chill of the moor was suddenly cut short. Step inside with her. Feel the sudden change in the air. The vast entrance hall was silent, but it was a warm, scented silence. The smell of beeswax, old books, and the faint, lingering aroma of wood smoke. The ceilings were so high they were lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with portraits of ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow the small, thin girl as she passed. Mrs. Medlock's keys made a soft, rhythmic jingling against her dress as she led the way. They walked over rugs so thick and soft that Mary's footsteps made no sound at all. It was as if the house itself were encouraging her to be quiet, to listen, to settle into its ancient rhythm. There were no shouting voices here, no frantic servants running to and fro as they had in India. Everything moved with a slow, deliberate grace. "This is your room," Mrs. Medlock said, opening a heavy door at the end of a long corridor. The room was large and dimly lit, but a fire was already roaring in the hearth. The flames danced in shades of deep orange and crimson, casting long, flickering shadows across the tapestries on the walls. There was a sturdy wooden bed with a thick, quilted counterpane, and a small table set with a bowl of hot porridge and a jug of fresh milk. Mary stood by the fire, feeling the heat seep into her bones. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of being anchored. In the vastness of the manor, this small circle of firelight was her sanctuary. The walls were thick 4 feet of solid stone, keeping the howling wind of the moor at a distance. Outside, the world was wild and unpredictable, but inside, there was order. There was safety. As she ate her supper, the only sound was the occasional crackle of a log shifting in the grate. The house seemed to breathe with her. It was a deep, slow respiration, the sound of a giant sleeping. Mary looked at the shadows on the ceiling and wondered about the other 99 rooms. Mrs. Medlock had told her she was not to wander, that many of the doors were locked and must remain so. But the thought of those hidden spaces did not frighten her tonight. They felt like secrets kept in a velvet box, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. She climbed into the high bed, the sheets smelling of lavender and cold wind. The mattress was soft, yielding to her weight, cradling her. As she lay there, the sourness she had carried from India felt heavy, like a garment she no longer needed to wear. Here, in the heart of the great stone manor, she was anonymous. She was just a small heartbeat in a very large, very old chest. The fire burned down to a steady, glowing ember. The light in the room turned a soft, dusky rose. Mary watched the last flicker of a flame before it vanished into the ash. She felt the tension in her neck and shoulders dissolve. The moor was still out there, stretching for miles in the dark, and the wind was still singing its lonely song against the window panes. But it could not reach her. She was tucked away in a fold of time. The manor was protecting her, not because it loved her yet, but because it was its nature to endure, to hold, and to keep. In the stillness, she began to hear something else, not the wind, and not the fire. It was a faint, distant sound, like a low, rhythmic tapping. Or perhaps it was just the house settling deeper into the earth for the night. As sleep began to pull at her senses, Mary realized that for the first time, she wasn't waiting for someone to come and tell her what to do. She was simply being. The vast, quiet house held her in its stone arms, and the darkness was not a void, but a soft, heavy curtain drawn against the world. She drifted off, her mind wandering through the silent corridors she had yet to see, past the locked doors and the hidden staircases, toward a place where the air felt even more still. Somewhere, deep within these walls, a secret was breathing, and in her sleep, Mary Lennox began to listen for its call. When Mary woke the next morning, the room was filled with a pale, soft light. The fire had long since died down to gray silk ashes, but the room remained held in a sturdy, quiet warmth. She sat up in the large bed, feeling the weight of the heavy blankets, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. Then, she looked at the window. Beyond the glass, there was no tropical sun, no dust, no vibrant parrot. There was only the vast, rolling gray-purple of the moor. The door opened, and a young woman named Martha entered. She was not like the servants in India who moved like shadows and never spoke unless commanded. Martha was a creature of the Yorkshire earth. Her cheeks were the color of red apples, and her voice had a brisk, musical lift to it. She began to poke the fire back to life, her movements rhythmic and confident. "It's a fine morning for the moor," Martha said, her words rolling like smooth stones in a stream. "The wind is blowing the cobwebs away." Mary watched her, fascinated by this person who didn't bow. Martha spoke of her home, a small cottage filled with 12 brothers and sisters, where the air was always thick with the smell of baking bread and the sound of laughter. She spoke of her brother, Dickon, a boy who could charm the foxes out of their holes and make the birds sing to him. "He's a lad of the wild," Martha smiled, "and the moor belongs to him as much as it belongs to the wind." As Mary listened, a strange sensation began to stir in her chest. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't boredom. It was interest. It was the first tiny crack in the ice of her heart. After breakfast, she put on her thick coat and sturdy boots, stepped out of the heavy manor door, and walked into the world. The air hit her face like a cold, wet cloth. It was sharp and smelled of salt and crushed herbs. She began to walk, her feet crunching on the gravel paths that wound through the gardens. These were not the manicured lawns she expected. They were wilder, older. There were great fountains that no longer flowed, their stone basins filled with moss and fallen leaves. There were long, arched walkways covered in bare, twisted vines that looked like sleeping serpents. She walked further, leaving the house behind until it was just a dark silhouette against the sky. The moor stretched out before her, an endless sea of heather and gorse. It looked lonely, yet it felt intensely alive. The wind didn't just blow, it sang. It whistled through the dry stalks of grass and hummed against the stone wall. Mary noticed a high wall made of old dark red brick. It was covered in a curtain of ivy so thick that it seemed to be part of the stone itself. She followed the wall, looking for a door, but there was none. She could see the tops of trees peering over the edge trees that looked different from the ones in the other gardens. They were stiller, as if they were holding their breath. A flash of red caught her eye. Perched on top of the wall was a tiny bird with a bright crimson breast. It was a robin. It tilted its head, watching her with eyes like polished black beads. It didn't fly away. Instead, it let out a series of liquid, golden notes, a song so clear and sweet that Mary found herself holding her breath. "Are you the only one who lives here?" she whispered. The robin chirped, hopped down onto a branch of ivy, and seemed to beckon her. Mary felt a pull, a magnetic curiosity that drew her closer to the wall. She reached out and touched the ivy. It was cold and waxy. Somewhere behind this barrier, something was waiting. She walked around the entire perimeter, her heart beating a little faster with every step. She felt as though she were in a dream, where everything had a meaning, if only she knew how to read it. The moor was no longer a barren waste. It was a giant, sleeping creature, and she was walking upon its back. The robin followed her, flitting from tree to tree, its song acting as a guide through the labyrinth of the outer gardens. Mary stopped. She looked at her hands. They were no longer pale and limp. They were flushed with the cold. She felt a hunger in her stomach that she hadn't felt in years. The safe feeling of the manor was now being replaced by the immersed feeling of the wild. She was becoming part of the landscape. The wind surged, ruffling the robin's feathers and sending a shower of yellow leaves dancing around Mary's feet. For the first time, she didn't want to go back inside. She wanted to know why this wall was so high. She wanted to know why the door had been lost for 10 years. Most of all, she wanted to know if the trees inside were still alive, or if they were ghosts of a garden that had died long ago. As the afternoon light began to turn to a soft, hazy gold, Mary stood perfectly still. The silence of the moor settled over her, but it was a different silence than the one in India. This was a silence full of possibilities. This was a silence that preceded a voice. She looked back at the manor, its many chimneys smoking in the distance. Then she looked back at the ivy-covered wall. The secret was there, breathing softly behind the stone, and the robin knew it. Tomorrow, she would return. Tomorrow, she would listen closer to the wind. For now, she carried the scent of the moor back with her, a wild, green promise that was just beginning to grow. The transition from the cold stone halls of the manor to the wild, breathing gardens began with a sound, a tiny, sharp chirp that seemed to puncture the heavy silence of the afternoon. Mary stood by the long brick wall, the one that had no door. The moss under her boots felt like a damp velvet carpet, and the air carried the faint, metallic scent of winter, turning toward an invisible spring. Nearby, she found Ben Weatherstaff. He was an old man, his skin as wrinkled and brown as a walnut shell, his back curved like the handle of a well-worn spade. He was digging in a flower bed that looked as though it were filled with nothing but sticks and dry leaves. He did not look up when she approached. In fact, he seemed to be grumbling to himself, a low, gravelly sound that matched the scraping of his shovel against the earth. "What are you doing?" Mary asked, her voice small against the vastness of the garden. Ben stopped. He leaned on his spade and looked at her with eyes that were surprisingly bright beneath his bushy brows. "I'm waking up the earth," he said, "though some things prefer to stay buried." He told her about the gardens, the fruit gardens, the vegetable patches, and the long, lonely walk. But when Mary asked about the wall with the ivy, Ben's face changed. The brightness left his eyes, replaced by a stony, distant look. "That's none of your concern," he muttered. "That place has been shut for 10 years. The key is gone, and the master wants it forgotten. Best you forget it too. But the moor has a way of not letting you forget. Just as Ben turned back to his digging, the robin appeared again. This time, he didn't stay on the wall. He flew down and hopped along the turned-over earth, just inches from Ben's heavy boots. The bird tilted its head, looking at Mary with a knowing, inquisitive expression. "Look at him," Ben grumbled, though his voice had softened. "He's a conceited little beggar. He thinks the whole garden was built just for him to sing in. He's the only one who knows what's behind that ivy, and he isn't telling." Up, the robin let out a long, trilling whistle. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. For the first time in her life, Mary felt a genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She felt a strange kinship with this tiny creature. He was solitary, just as she was. He lived in a world of giants and stone walls, yet he was not afraid. He was free. "Will he come to me?" she whispered. "If you're quiet," Ben said, "and if you have a bit of heart in you." Birds know. They can smell a sour soul a mile off. Mary stood perfectly still. She watched the robin hop closer. His tiny claws made invisible marks in the soft soil. Every time he moved, a little more of the tension in Mary's chest seemed to evaporate. She wasn't the sour girl from India anymore. She was a watcher, a listener. The robin suddenly took flight. He didn't go far. He flew to a thick, hanging curtain of ivy that draped over the mysterious wall. The wind caught the ivy, swinging it outward like a heavy green veil. For a split second, Mary saw something. It wasn't a door. Not yet. It was a glimpse of a dark iron ring, half buried under a decade of growth. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp leap. The robin perched on a branch just above the iron ring and began to preen his feathers, looking down at her as if to say, "Well, are you coming?" The air felt different now. The transition was complete. She was no longer just wandering the grounds of a stranger's house. She was a seeker on a trail. The gray mist of the moor didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like a curtain drawn over a stage before the play begins. "I'll find it," Mary whispered to the bird. "I'll find where you go when the sun sets." Ben Weatherstaff watched her go, a small, dark figure moving determinedly along the base of the wall. He shook his head and went back to his digging, but there was a ghost of a smile on his weathered face. The garden was changing. The air was moving. The silence that had sat heavy on Mistlethwaite for 10 years was being disturbed by the lightest of things, the flutter of a wing and the footsteps of a curious child. As Mary walked back toward the manor for the evening, she didn't look at the dark windows or the smoking chimneys. She looked at the ground, searching for any sign of a rusted key, any hint that the earth was ready to give up its secrets. The robin's song stayed with her, echoing in the quiet chambers of her mind, a golden thread leading her through the labyrinth. The night was coming, and the manor would soon be wrapped in its protective shroud of fog. But tonight, Mary Lennox wouldn't just sleep. She would dream of green things pushing through the dirt, and of a door that had no handle, waiting for the wind to blow the ivy aside one more time. The mystery was no longer outside of her. It was beginning to take root within, a soft, insistent pulse of life that refused to be ignored. The next morning, the moor was wrapped in a pearl-colored mist, so thick that the world seemed to have vanished, leaving only Mary and the secret she carried in her pocket. The night before, she had found it a heavy, rusted piece of iron buried in the dirt. It was the key. It felt cold against her palm, a solid piece of the past that had finally surfaced. She walked toward the wall, her heart performing a slow, rhythmic drum beat against her ribs. The robin was there, waiting. He didn't sing today. He watched with a quiet, solemn intensity. He hopped onto the swinging curtain of ivy, and as the wind gave a sudden, playful tug, The leaves parted just enough. There, nestled in the brickwork, was the lock. Mary's hand trembled slightly as she lifted the key. It was stiff, clogged with 10 years of Yorkshire dust and winter rain. She pressed it in. She turned it. Click. Dia. It was a small sound, but in the vast silence of the manor grounds, it felt like a thunderclap. It was the sound of a decade ending. She pushed the door. It resisted at first, the hinges groaning with a slow, metallic protest, and then it yielded. Mary stepped over the threshold and closed the door behind her. She was inside. Imagine a world where everything has turned to silver and gray. The garden was a forest of roses, but they were not like any roses Mary had ever seen. They were twisted, climbing high into the branches of ancient apple trees, hanging in long, ethereal festoons that swayed in the breeze like the hair of ghosts. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of brown, matted grass, and the paths were lost under a decade of neglect. It was so still, a different kind of stillness than the manor. The manor was a place where people were kept out. This was a place where life was kept in. Mary walked softly, her boots making no sound on the damp earth. She looked at the trees. Their bark was gray and shaggy, and they looked as though they had been carved from stone. She reached out and touched a stem. It felt dry and brittle. Is it all dead? She whispered to the air. She knelt down and began to clear away the dead leaves from the base of a tree. She used her bare hands, feeling the cool, moist soil beneath the surface. And then she saw it. A tiny, sharp point of pale green, no bigger than a needle, poking through the dark earth. Then another, and another. They were crocuses. They were the wick things Martha had talked about. They weren't dead. They were just sleeping, huddled deep in the dark, waiting for the sun to find them. The realization washed over Mary like a wave of warm water. The garden was not a tomb. It was a cradle. She spent the next few hours in a state of trance-like devotion. She moved from one corner to another, pulling away the choking weeds, clearing the breathing space for the tiny green points. She didn't feel the cold. She didn't feel the damp. She only felt the connection between her fingers and the living earth. For every weed she pulled, she felt a little bit of the sourness leave her own spirit. She was no longer a spectator in her own life. She was a gardener. The trees above her seemed to lean down, watching her work. The long trailing branches of the roses brushed against her shoulders like gentle hands. The air inside the walls was sheltered from the harsh moor wind, creating a pocket of absolute peace. It was a temple of nature, a place where the only clock was the slow turning of the seasons. The robin flew down and sat on a sundial covered in lichen. He watched her with approval. Here, inside the secret walls, the boundary between the child and the wild began to dissolve. Mary felt a strange humming energy in her limbs. It was as if the life in the soil was flowing up through her fingertips and into her heart. As the sun began to dip below the high stone walls, casting long violet shadows across the sleeping roses, Mary stood up. Her hands were dark with earth, and her face was flushed. She looked around at the small patches of cleared ground she had made. They were tiny victories, but they were enough. She walked back to the hidden door, touching the ivy one last time. She stepped out, locked the door, and hid the key once more. The garden was once again a secret to the rest of the world, but it was no longer a secret to her. She carried the image of those tiny green points in her mind like a treasure. The manor loomed ahead, its windows beginning to glow with candlelight. Mary walked toward it, her pace steady and calm. She wasn't going back to a prison. She was going back to a place of rest so she could return to her work tomorrow. The loop had begun the cycle of tending, watching, and waiting. The garden was breathing, and for the first time, Mary Lennox was breathing with it. The silence of the evening was no longer empty. It was full of the sound of growing things. a slow subterranean music that played just beneath the surface of the world, lulling her toward a sleep filled with dreams of emerald and gold. The rhythm of the days began to change, shifting from the stagnant pulse of the manor to the vibrant, slow-motion heartbeat of the earth. Every morning, Mary awoke with a purpose that tugged at her sleeve. She no longer lingered in the heavy silence of her bed. She dressed quickly, her movements sharp and eager, driven by the thought of the small, green lives waiting for her behind the ivy-covered wall. The air on the moor was turning. It was no longer the biting, aggressive cold of midwinter. Instead, it was a growing wind breeze that carried the scent of rain-washed stone and the faint, sweet musk of waking roots. Mary spent hours on her knees. Imagine the feeling of the soil cool, crumbly, and dark. She learned to distinguish between the weeds that strangled and the wick things that promised flowers. She cleared away the gray, matted grass, revealing the pale shoots of crocuses, snowdrops, and daffodil. With every inch of ground she reclaimed, she felt a corresponding space open up inside her own chest. She was no longer a stiff, sour little girl. Her face had lost its sallow paleness. A soft, healthy glow, the color of a wild rose, began to bloom on her cheeks. She was learning the language of the garden. She understood the way the sun hit the southern wall first, warming the bricks until they acted like a hearth for the tenderest vines. She watched the way the rain pooled in the hollows of the ancient trees, providing a drink for the insects that were beginning to stir. One morning, while she was focused on a particularly stubborn clump of grass, a shadow fell across her work. It wasn't the sharp, dark shadow of a wall, but something softer, more organic. She looked up and saw a boy sitting under a tree. He was about 12 years old, with a face as round and red as a berry and eyes the color of the moorland sky. He sat so perfectly still that a squirrel was perched on his shoulder, nibbling at a nut, and 2 rabbits sat near his feet as if he were nothing more than a mossy stump. This was Dickon. He didn't startle her. His presence was so integrated into the landscape that it felt as natural as a rock or a bush. He carried a small spade and a sack of seeds, and he smelled of crushed leaves and fresh heather. "I've come to help thee," he said, his voice a low, musical burr. "The robin told me where thou wert." Dickon moved through the secret garden with a quiet, reverent expertise. He didn't just dig. He whispered to the plants. He showed Mary how to prune the dead wood from the roses without hurting the living heart of the branch. He taught her how to plant seeds in little nests of rich, dark compost, tucking them in as if they were sleeping birds. "Everything's waken up," he whispered, his eyes scanning the gray branches. "It's a bit of magic, isn't it? Thou can't see it happening, but if thou stays quiet enough, thou can feel the stirrin' under thy feet." They worked together in a companionable silence that was deeper and more healing than any conversation. The loop of the day became a meditation. Digging, planting, watering, breathing. The sun traced a slow arc across the sky, turning the mist into a golden haze that hung between the tree. Mary watched Dickon's hands. They were strong and earthy, moving with a grace that came from a deep love for the world. She realized that she was no longer lonely. She had the garden, she had the robin, and now she had this boy who was a part of the wind itself. The secrecy of the garden was no longer a burden of isolation. It was a shared sanctuary, a world within a world where the rules of the manor did not apply. As the afternoon light began to soften into a hazy violet, the garden felt heavy with potential. The slow story of growth was unfolding in every leaf and every bud. The roses, once ghostly and gray, were beginning to show tiny, red eyes, the first signs of new life. Dickon gathered his things, the squirrels and rabbits following him as if he were their king. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised. "We've got a lot of waking up to do." Mary stayed for a few moments after he left. She sat on the wooden bench, her hands resting in her lap, stained with the honest dark of the soil. She felt a profound sense of belonging. The earth was her mother now, and the sky was her roof. The safe feeling of the manor was nothing compared to the safe feeling of being held by the ancient enduring cycle of nature. The air grew still. The robin flew to the topmost branch of the tallest tree and sang a final, triumphant song to the setting sun. Mary closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. She felt wick from head to toe. She felt as though she, too, had been buried in the dark for 10 years and was only now, finally, beginning to find the light. The garden was no longer a place of ghosts. It was a place of ghosts being reborn into something beautiful. And as she walked back to the manor, the heavy stone walls no longer felt like a fortress. They felt like a shell that she would soon outgrow. The mystery was deepening, the roots were reaching further, and the air was thick with the promise of a miracle that was no longer just a dream, but a living, breathing reality. The wind on the moor has 1,000 voices, but that night it carried a sound that did not belong to the heather or the gorse. It was a low, thin wail, a human sound that seemed to seep through the very stones of Mistlethwaite Manor. Mary sat up in her bed, the fire in her grate now a heap of glowing rubies. She took her candle, the flame dancing nervously in the draught, and stepped out into the long, dark corridor. The house felt immense, a sleeping leviathan. Her footsteps were swallowed by the heavy runners of carpet as she followed the sound, past the lines of unblinking portraits and the heavy locked doors. She reached a tapestry that hung floor to ceiling, and as she lifted the heavy fabric, she found a door she had never seen before. She pushed it open. Inside was a room grander than her own, filled with the scent of dried flowers and expensive medicine. In the center of a massive 4-poster bed lay a boy. He looked as fragile as a bird made of glass. His skin so pale it was almost translucent, and his eyes large, gray, and filled with a terrible, hollow fear. "Are you a ghost?" the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "No," Mary replied, stepping into the circle of his candlelight. "I am Mary Lennox. Dex. Are you the secret of this house?" This was Colin. For 10 years, he had been kept in this room, hidden away by a father who could not bear to look at him, and by servants who whispered that he would grow up to have a crooked back, or that he wouldn't grow up at all. He lived in a self-imposed prison of silk and shadows, convinced that the world outside was a place of danger and that his own body was his enemy. But Mary, hardened by the winds of the moor and the honest labor of the garden, did not look at him with pity. She looked at him with the blunt honesty of a child. "You aren't dying," she said firmly, sitting on the edge of his bed. "You're just lonely, and you've stayed in the dark too long." For the rest of the night, the return to safe feeling enveloped the room. The candle burned steadily, creating a small island of warmth in the vast, cold manor. Mary told him about the moor. She told him about the robin, about Ben Weatherstaff, and about the boy named Dickon, who could talk to animals. But most importantly, she told him about the secret garden. As she spoke, the tension in Colin's face began to soften. His hands, which had been clenched tight against the silk sheets, slowly relaxed. He listened to the story of the wick things pushing through the earth, and for the first time, the wailing stopped. The mystery of the garden became a lifeline, a reason to look toward the morning. "Is it truly alive?" Colin asked, his eyes wide with a hunger for something other than medicine. "It is," Mary whispered. "It's waiting for you. The roses are making new wood, and the bulbs are breaking the soil. It's a bit of magic, Colin, but you have to see it for yourself." In that quiet chamber, a bridge was built. 2 lonely children, both ignored and both sour in their own ways, found a reflection of themselves in the other. The room no longer felt like a sick room. It felt like a cocoon. The safety was no longer about thick walls and locked doors. It was the safety of being understood. Mary stayed until the first gray light of dawn touched the heavy velvet curtains. She stood up and pulled them back just an inch to let the morning in. "I'll come back every day," she promised. "And when the sun is warm enough, we'll take you there. We'll show you that the world isn't a place to fear." Colin watched her go, his mind no longer filled with images of his own illness, but with the scent of fresh earth and the image of a hidden door. The return to safe loop was complete. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, his sleep was not haunted by the sound of the wind, but filled with the rustle of leaves and the promise of a golden key. The house was still silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the expectant hush that comes before a grand awakening. Deep in the heart of Mistlethwaite, the secret was no longer a source of pain. It had become a seed of hope, buried deep, but already starting to stir toward the light. The high walls of the secret garden, once a boundary of exclusion, had become a golden bowl that caught the full warmth of the Yorkshire spring. The gray, ghostly wood of the winter was gone, replaced by a riot of living green. Roses, thousands of them, hung in heavy, fragrant curtains from the walls and swung in delicate arches from the trees. They were every shade of cream, blush, and deep, velvet crimson, breathing their sweetness into the air until the very wind seemed to taste of honey. In the center of this emerald kingdom, the impossible was happening. Colin was no longer the porcelain boy in the shadowed room. He was sitting on the grass, his face upturned to the sky, his skin bronzed by the sun. Beside him, the heavy wooden wheelchair stood empty, looking like a relic from a forgotten age. Dickon sat nearby. A young fox curled in his lap, and a crow perched on his shoulder. While Mary moved among the flower beds, her movements fluid and strong. "Look," Colin whispered, his voice steady and clear. "I can feel the magic pulling me up." With a slow, deliberate strength that seemed to draw power directly from the earth, Colin stood. He did not wobble. He did not fall. He planted his feet on the soil, feeling the grass between his toes, and he walked. It was a simple act, yet in the cathedral of the garden, it felt like a sacred ceremony. He was not just walking. He was returning to the world of the living. He was the final seed to break through the dark crust of the earth and find the light. The silence that followed was not the heavy silence of the manor. It was the breathless hush of a miracle. Far away, across the seas and the mountains, Archibald Craven had been wandering in a fog of his own sorrow. He had carried the weight of his broken heart like a suit of leaden armor, unable to find peace in any valley or any city. But that morning, as he slept by a lake in Austria, he had dreamed of a voice like a silver bell calling him home to the garden. The drift ending began the moment he stepped through the hidden door. He had expected to find a tomb, a place of dead roses and bitter memories. Instead, he found a paradise. He saw a tall, handsome boy running across the grass, laughing with a girl whose eyes sparkled like the moorland streams. When Colin saw his father, he did not cower. He ran to him, his legs strong, his heart open. "Father!" the boy cried. "It's the garden. It has made me well." Archibald Craven fell to his knees, not in grief, but in a profound, soul-shaking gratitude. The leaden armor of 10 years shattered and fell away. He took his son into his arms, and for the first time, the manor behind them ceased to be a house of 100 ghosts. The shadows that had stretched across the hallways for a decade were finally chased away by the bright, unyielding sun of the present. The garden had done its work. It had healed the child of neglect, the boy of fear, and the man of sorrow. It had taken their broken pieces and woven them into a tapestry of life. The afternoon light began to mellow, turning into a deep, liquid amber that slanted through the branches of the apple trees. The birds began their evening hymns, a layered chorus of calls and whistles that filled the air with a sense of completion. There was no more urgency. The struggle to grow was over. Now, there was only the beauty of being. Mary stood back, watching the father and son. She felt a quiet, glowing satisfaction in her own heart. She had been the one to find the key. She had been the one to clear the first weed. But she knew that she, too, had been tended by the garden. Her sharp edges had been softened, her sourness replaced by a deep, earthy wisdom. The world seemed to slow down. The rustle of the wind through the rose petals was the only clock that mattered. Everything was in its right place. The moor stretched out beyond the walls, vast and eternal, but it no longer felt lonely. It felt like a protective sea surrounding their island of peace. As the sun touched the horizon, casting long violet shadows that cradled the flowers, a sense of profound rest settled over Mistlethwaite. The drift was taking hold. The stories of the past were being rewritten in the language of the leaves. The pain was gone, dissolved into the scent of the earth and the cool touch of the evening dew. There was nothing left to fear. The doors were open, the secrets were shared, and the magic, the simple, natural magic of growth and love was everywhere. It was in the breath of the children, the pulse of the trees, and the golden light that lingered on the walls, refusing to let the day go until every heart was full. The sun has finally dipped below the edge of the world, leaving behind a sky the color of crushed violets and deep, cool indigo. The secret garden, so vibrant and gold just an hour ago, is now beginning to settle into its nightly prayer. The colors of the roses have faded into soft, velvety shadows, and the scent of the earth has grown heavier, richer, and more grounding. Listen to the silence. It is not the silence of something missing. It is the silence of something fulfilled. The robin has tucked his head beneath his wing, perched in the heart of the thickest ivy. The squirrels have retreated to the hollows of the ancient oaks, and the rabbits are warm in their burrows beneath the heather. Even the wind, which roars across the moor during the day, has softened to a mere whisper, a gentle sigh that brushes against the stone walls of Mistlethwaite Manor. Inside the house, the long corridors are dark and still. The many rooms, once filled with the echoes of loneliness and the weight of secrets, are now places of rest. In one room, Mary Lennox lies fast asleep, her breathing as rhythmic as the swaying of a branch. In another, Colin rests, his limbs relaxed, his heart quiet, no longer afraid of the shadows. And in a room that had been cold for 10 years, Archibald Craven sleeps with a peace that he thought had vanished forever. The garden is their guardian now. It stands in the moonlight, a silver sanctuary where the magic of growth continues in the dark. Roots are reaching deeper into the cool soil, drinking in the moisture of the night. Buds are tightening, preparing for the first touch of tomorrow's dew. Everything is in a state of beautiful, necessary pause. Now, imagine yourself standing at the hidden door one last time. The iron key is safe in the earth. The ivy is still. You can feel the coolness of the night air on your skin. But you are wrapped in a warmth that comes from within. You are part of this cycle. You are a leaf on the tree, a seed in the furrow, a stone in the wall. You are held. You are safe. The manor is a dark silhouette against the stars, a grand old vessel anchored in a sea of heather. There is no more wailing in the pipes, no more footsteps in the night, only the steady, subterranean pulse of the Yorkshire earth. As the moonlight spills over the sundial, marking a time that no longer needs to be counted, let your own thoughts begin to dissolve. Let the images of the green shoots and the crimson roses soften and blur. The story has reached its home. The garden is closed, but it remains open in the quiet chambers of your mind. The world outside is far away. Its noises cannot reach you here, behind these walls of ancient brick and living vine. You are in the heart of the mystery, and the mystery is kind. It is a place where everything that was broken has been mended, and everything that was lost has been found. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the softness of the bed, just as the petals fall softly onto the grass, one by one. Light, tight, calm. Silent, tidy. Perfect. The darkness is a velvet blanket, embroidered with the scent of lavender and old stone. It is a gift. It is a space for you to let go. The magic that Mary found is still here. It is in the way your breath slows down. It is in the way the tension leaves your hand. It is in the stillness of the room. It is the quiet power that turns the seasons and wakes the flowers. And right now, it is guiding you toward the deepest, most restful sleep. The secret garden is never truly silent. It breathes with the universe. And as you drift further into the mist, the last thing you hear is the faint, comforting rustle of the leaves, telling you that all is well, all is grown, all is at rest. The light is gone. The story is told. The garden is dreaming. Sleep now. Drift into the emerald shadows. Let the moor carry you away on its wide, dark wings. Behind the ivy, under the moon, the roses are waiting for the sun, but you have found the light in the dark. Rest tight. Rest. What? The garden is watching over you.